let's just have a look here. I'm just interested to see whether people respond to my questions. Oh no, we've got a few in there. It's some very tiny and hard to read. So, let's see if I can see some themes here. No. Somebody sees the world slightly differently now. That makes me feel like I have more responsibility than perhaps is fair. A mail order bride is technically considered a contract. To be fair, I think we need more information to know whether a mail order bride is actually a contract or not, that intention to enter into a legal relationship, and whether it might be human trafficking. But hey, that's a different subject. A lot of people do point out that the case law is very old. I actually was talking to a colleague of mine today in the business school who it was kind of amazed when I say like a modern case in this subject is 1970. Like I get quite excited if I have anything in this millennia. But what's the reason for that? Why are the cases so old? Does anybody have any insight there? Just because we're too bored to bother changing things around? Your name's gone out of my head. Angelica, sorry.
That's right, just assuming a lot of time things will go to settlement, not necessarily through the court.
Things go to settlement, not through the court. That is a really interesting element. It's probably not the primary reason though, but I'd like to circle back to that in just a second, because I think it's a really important point for you thinking about becoming contract lawyers. Clay, what's your thought on that one?
Just that contract doesn't have to update like with society as much as other kinds of law. Like
Contract doesn't have to update as much. In fact, we might even flip that around the other way, that there are good economic reasons why a society doesn't want its contract law to change very often. It's like, I know that's kind of a chicken and egg way of looking at it, but it's not so much that it doesn't need to update. I think when we start talking about consideration, you might think, really, this should have been updated. Like, this is a very strange way of approaching this particular problem. But that certainty of knowing that contracts will be dealt with the same way has an economic benefit. I want to say Andrew.
Close. Harry.
It's not even close, really. The second letter is an A, yeah, and other than that, no. Harry, sorry. There's another Harry in here too, and I've mixed you up. I know there are two of you. Yeah, you've really got nothing very much in common at all other than, yeah, okay, anyway. So.
I was going to say maybe it has something to do with like circumstances not necessitating the creation of new law. So there hasn't been a circumstance that have arisen in contract disputes that have necessitated new common law to be created, because you can just refer back to what already has happened in the past.
Yeah, I think that's very similar to Angelica's point, and it's a good one in the sense that in some ways you would think there are lots of circumstances, lots of changes to the way that we do business that would necessitate new law. Smart contracts. Has anybody heard of this idea of a smart contract? So a smart contract is a contract that sits on the blockchain. So, yep, we've got one person here. You've heard about them as well. Smart contracts are happening in financial services. They're one of the reasons why Bitcoin continues to have some value and is pushing up again, because smart contracts are often done in that particular cryptocurrency. I think the other main reason is because people do illegal things with that currency. So anyway, don't let me diverge too much. But so these different ways of doing business you would think would necessitate new law. The advent of the internet. But when we think about the advent of the internet, really the textbook carries on about the Electronic Communications Act as if it's kind of a difficult thing to understand, but really it's a restatement of the law as it stood for any kind of instant communication. So if Sigrid and I are having a conversation and we make a contract, the contract is made at the time and in the place where an offer is accepted. But if Sigrid and I have that same conversation via email, doesn't matter what countries we are in, the contract will be made at the time and the place that the email is received. And received means capable of receipt from a human point of view. But it's really just a restatement of what the law was. I think it does go back to this Clay's point here of the economic certainty, that the courts are loath to change the way that contracts work because they want to provide a consistent space for doing business. Craig.
Well done.
I went through about 4 other names to get there, but thank you. Craig.
Is the email receipt the server or where your laptop is?
Server, where it's capable of being received.
And if there are mirror sites, and you pick it up off like an Australian Mirror?
It's the server, the first server that it hits where it's capable of being received. So it's not really an issue. That's the thing. That's what I say. Your textbook will make it sound like this ridiculously complex thing. I think it's just a whole lot of contract lawyers getting excited that something new is happening. At the end of the day, it's the place where it's capable of being... So, again, it hasn't been tested, but if you had an account with a NBN service provider in Australia, it would be treated as happening in Australia wherever that place is, where there's... But often we don't even know where servers are. So you have no idea. So... Emily, sorry. Do you know what's going through my head there is your name doesn't have a Y on the end of it. I don't know why I realised that recently. And so then I got stuck in my head as to whether or not I had the right name in my... Because I think it was spelt differently.
It's like a meal.
Yeah, Emile. Go off, Emile.
I remember reading something, and I can't remember, like, it was a couple of weeks ago now, so I can't remember the details, but to do with emails, and it's something about when it becomes capable of being received, being to do with whether or not that person had actually designated that email as their... But does that only...
So in the definition in the section, it says the designated email address, which means the address that the person has given as being the address they can be contacted at. So I have about 25 email addresses, as everybody does these days. They all actually point to the same place, like they all just end up in the same inbox roughly. Well, they don't actually. I've recently separated out the rmit.edu.au ones and they go into separate inbox because I'm deathly worried that somebody's going to send me personal information that they shouldn't and I don't want to be responsible for it. But everything else goes to the same email address, and one of those is a Gmail account. God knows where that server is. Possibly in Singapore, maybe in, Nevada somewhere. And they're not going to tell us for very good reasons. Another one is my hosting is Amazon Web Services. So that is possibly in Singapore, but it might be in Sydney. I don't know. Again, it's worth pointing out that these things are often technical issues and not real issues. They're not... At the end of the day, most contracts come and go are concluded without anybody making a fuss at all. The only time that these kind of issues become issues is when somebody actually doesn't want to do the thing they promised to do, or they want a different law to apply for some particular reason. Also, just because the law says that doesn't mean that that's stuck forever. The law is your default position. So the provisions themselves say, unless the parties have agreed otherwise, then the law of that place and that time will apply. More often than not, when we actually put an agreement together, we'll say, actually, we're doing business in Australia, in Victoria. I have an obligation to charge you GST under a different set of laws, so I'm going to make those laws apply so I don't have to pay tax somewhere else as well. So the parties can agree, and often one of the things you'll do when you do the second assignment is you'll have a look at some boilerplate provisions and look at the kinds of provisions that go into agreements over and over again, and mostly they go in because people are trying to avoid the messiness of these kind of situations. So almost every agreement that you see will have a choice of law clause. So even when you're clicking I accept on a website somewhere, you'll head off, if you actually follow the links, it'll tell you that the law of New York or Delaware or Ireland or Ukraine or wherever applies. It's very rarely Australia. Everyday contracts are, so often people notice that they're making a lot more contracts than they realise they were, that actually contracts are something that they're very familiar with. The thing I usually see on this list is invitations to treat. That's usually the thing that blows your mind, but clearly you're all a bit too mature for that. So why do this? Other than it just give me a sideways opportunity to give a little sermon, which I clearly like to do. I think it's a really good thing in any subject to just stop every 2 or 3 weeks and just reflect. Just think, what do I know now that I didn't know before? Because often, particularly when you're writing assignments, but often in the real world, once you actually absorb, you forget what you didn't know at the beginning, and you forget that other people don't know those things. So when you are advising your clients, and your clients aren't lawyers, you might approach advising them in a different way from when you're talking to another lawyer about the law. So an invitation to treat is usually the thing that gives me that opportunity. If you have a problem that really goes to whether an offer was made or not, and it's an invitation to treat type problem, explaining that to a lawyer is a completely different exercise from explaining it to a non-lawyer. You can use the shorthand a little bit more. So stopping and actually reflecting on what you've learned. Also because it's so overwhelming when you're doing this. I mean, we were just talking before we started, a few people were saying how much reading they have. It's very easy to sort of not see the forest for the trees. So stand back and have a look at the trees occasionally, or look at the forest occasionally and say, okay, what do I know now that I didn't know before? And start to consolidate that. If nothing else, it'll make you feel better.